Welcome back. Here we go, the real world. I'm going to look at the whole climate ecological crisis. I'm going to do it in a particular sort of way. And I guess I'm going to be suggesting that when you communicate it to people you need to communicate it to, you're going to do it in a similar way. And I'm going to give some reasons for that. So I'm just going to jump straight in. So I'm going to start off with the reality, which is the world is a gas chamber. Literally, it's a gas chamber in the sense the atmosphere is there. We depend upon those gases to breathe and to live, and there's no escape. I think that's about as fundamental as it gets in terms of setting the scene. And what we need to understand, of course, is that poisonous gas has been put into that gas chamber, into the atmosphere for 200 years now, but at a massive rate for the last 30 years, during which people have well known exactly what the consequences will be. And those consequences are now largely locked in. So what we're talking about here is a murder project, a method of murder, which involves putting a gas that's going to destroy the lives and livelihoods of your generation. And it's important to understand, and I'm going to go into this in more detail, it's important to understand that what the climate means is not icebergs and polar bears. It's what it actually comes out at as, which counts. So what it comes out at, how your generation is going to experience it, is through war, which means the slaughter and death of people, through starvation, not having enough to eat and dying because you don't have enough to eat, and rape. That's the reality. And the word that sums it up, which is why I've used this word, is annihilation. Annihilation is a project to murder on a massive scale. And I talked to a London lawyer, and I think this is a good way of summing it up. And he said, there's no greater crime. So what we're seeing here is a project to have billions of people die. It's a project that is knowingly undertaken, so that constitutes mass murder. And it's a crime. It will be and needs to be punished. So once we look at it like that, it all changes, right? It's not something accidental. It's not something about the environment. So that's my proposition, and I'm going to, in the next few minutes, give you the numbers that show that this is actually the case. So the important thing to understand about climate science, as it were, is that you can cherry pick, and that word is thrown around. So I'm going to give a definition of it for you. So cherry picking is to choose a stat which isn't the whole picture. You know, you can say, well, it was warm in New York, so climate change isn't happening, or something else is happening. So what you want to do is to actually get the bottom line number. So you don't want to know how hot it was that year, this year. You want to know what it's like over the whole world over a long period of time. So let's start off with the temperature. So the temperature now in 2020 is 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial. And I'll explain what these figures mean in a minute. That's a fact. And over the last 10 years, the temperature has increased by 0.3. That's another fact. And the decade before that it increased by 0.2. So the first thing to establish is we're at 1.3, and it's going to go up by 0.3 at a minimum in the next decade, probably 0.4 because it's going up in an increasing fashion. So the most important calculation for your generation is 1.3 plus 0.3 equals 1.6 over the next 5 to 10 years. And the reason why that is the most important calculation for your generation, of course, is because for our generation and for the people that run the world, they run on a delusion called the Paris Agreement, which aims to keep the temperature below 1.5. So what we know is we're going over 1.5 in the next 5 to 10 years. And so we know that the Paris Agreement is wrong. Let's put it like that. Or maybe we should say it's a massive delusion. One way or another, it's irrelevant because those are the numbers. Okay, so let's choose some other numbers. So we're at 415 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere in 2020. That's not quite right because we need to do the carbon in the atmosphere, the CO2 in the atmosphere across all the greenhouse gases, including methane and what have you. If we do that, then it's 500 parts per million. So what does that mean? We know 450 parts per million is 2 degrees locked in. We also know that 560 parts per million, which we could be passing by the mid-century, will lock in around 5 degrees temperature increase. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So we've done the temperature increase, we've done the parts per million. This is the raw, unavoidable bottom line killer facts, right? So let's do the third killer fact. The Arctic ice will be melted in the Arctic in the summer by 2035, give or take 5 to 10 years. So that's a peer-reviewed paper. And at the bottom of this video, by the way, you can find some links. So that means two things. Once there's a blue ocean event, as it's called, then the temperature will massively increase in the Arctic because the dark water will absorb heat rather than reflect it as you get on a white surface. This is basic physics. So what that will mean is the temperature difference between the Arctic, which is warmed up, and the equator will be lessened. And what that means is the jet stream, which is the wind that goes around the northern hemisphere, will slow down. And then you get something called weather blocking. What weather blocking means is that you get the same weather for a lot longer because the weather systems are moving more slowly around the Earth. What that means is you're not going to be able to grow crops because what crops need, and I can say with this as a farmer, is a variety of weather. You need it to be sunny, and then you need it to be raining, and then you need it to be sunny. So if it's like doesn't rain for 5, 7, 12 weeks, then you lose the crop. If it rains every day for 4, 7, 12 weeks, then you lose all your crops. If it's really hot or really cold or really wet or really dry, you lose your crops. So that's the first problem. The second problem, obviously, is it will increase the temperature of the planet. And the peer-reviewed paper this year, and here's the number, is that when the Arctic is melted in the summer by 2035, we're looking at 0.4 of a degree increase in global temperatures as a result of that eventuality. And that's going to happen effectively immediately. The other thing that isn't really talked about but needs to be talked about is global dimming. So what happens, in case you're not aware of this, and this is a real headfuck, so be prepared if you don't know, is that when you put carbon into the atmosphere through fossil fuels, you also put pollution into the air, small particles, and those particles shade the sun's rays. And what that means is that the full temperature increase is not felt on the Earth's surface because you've got all this pollution in the air. Now, if you stop burning fossil fuels, which obviously you have to do, then that pollution will be reduced. And if there's no fossil fuels, that pollution won't exist at all. Now, if you do that, then there's no small particles shading the Earth from the sun, and the temperature will increase, depending upon which paper you read, between around 0.2 degrees centigrade and 1 degree centigrade. So let's try and average that out and say it's half a degree. Okay, so what we need to understand here, and why the younger generation is heading for annihilation, is because we're heading over 2 degrees. We've also got the Arctic melting, which takes us to 2.5. We've got the global dimming problem, which takes us towards 3 degrees. And that seems to be the average. That's not an extreme scenario. I mean, I should say I read 2 to 3 science articles a week, and I have done for 4 or 5 years now. So this is what you might call the summary, the key unavoidables, as you might say. I'm going to just mention 1 or 2 other items because we don't want to be here all day on it. And then I'm going to talk about the implications. So the other things that we need to be aware of is the Greenland ice sheet is going to melt. There's some dispute about whether it's definitely going to melt, but I think it's a fair prediction to say it will melt regardless of whether we reduce carbon emissions to 0. And then there's estimates that will produce 1, 2, 3 meters of sea level rise. Around 3 meters of sea level rise means that every city on the coast and town on the coast will need to be evacuated later in the century. It's also the case that the ice cap in West Antarctica has now passed its tipping point. So again, that's 5 meters, I think, of sea level rise, 7 meters from Greenland. So there's a little bit of a question about it, but it's a fair bet that we're going to have multiple meters of sea level rise by the time you get to old age. The next thing to consider is the Amazon. So again, what's the bottom line figures? 17% cut down or degraded at this point in time in 2021. So I've been trying to ask scientists about this, but it seems like there's a broad consensus, and again, this isn't a peer-reviewed paper, that between 20 and 25% of the Amazon being cut down will trigger the destruction and dieback of the Amazon, which of course will raise temperatures even more than what I've just mentioned. And then we could also talk about the acidification of the ocean and the massive increase in forest fires and the warming up of the soils, which incidentally could increase temperatures by up to 1 degree centigrade over the next 50 years. So we've got a few things that are really clear, and then we've got a few wild cards. And the biggest wild card, of course, is methane coming out of the permafrost. So I read recently, for instance, that if 1% of the permafrost escapes, which is a substantial possibility in the next 10 to 20 years, that will increase global temperatures by 1.4 degrees, 0.2 of a degree a year over 7 years. Okay, so in most science presentations, you've probably noticed, the scientists will give you this information, but they don't follow the story through. It's a bit like watching a Hollywood movie, isn't it? And the bad guys are about to win, but you don't find out what the rest of the movie is. So the rest of the movie in this situation is it gets worse and worse. Because what you need to know is, what does it actually concretely mean for your lives? So again, I'll give you 3 or 4 key statistics. So the first thing to understand is when the scientists say 2 degrees centigrade, that's the global average figure. I think 66% of the world is covered by ocean. And so most of it is the temperature above the oceans. The fact of the matter is that once you get inland, you have to double that or even triple it. So when you're talking about 2 degrees centigrade, you're actually talking about an average of 4 or 5 or 6 degrees centigrade in the centre of Europe or Africa, the centre of the USA or Russia. But that is just the average temperature. So where it gets like horrific is what you consider it will be on a hot day or in a heat wave. So for instance, if it's 5 degrees centigrade, let's say at 2 degrees, so it's 5 degrees in Russia or 5 degrees in the centre of the US, it's a fair bet that it's going to be 10 or 15 degrees over the average for 5 or 6 or 10 weeks a year. And if it's that level of temperature, i.e., 30, 40, 50 degrees centigrade, then you'll kill the crops. So that's the reality of 2 degrees centigrade. So you can look this up. At 2 degrees centigrade, i.e. 4 degrees in the centre of continents, you're looking at losing 20, 30, 40, 50% of your grain production and your corn production on an average year, right? The other thing to consider is the wet bulb effect. So the wet bulb effect is the truly terrifying cliff edge in terms of heat. The important thing to understand about the wet bulb effect is if your body gets to a certain temperature and the humidity gets to a certain temperature, then regardless of how healthy you are, you'll die within 6 hours. It's a little bit like hypothermia. If you go out in sub-zero temperatures, then there is a point at which your body freezes and you die. It's the same with heat. And so what the wet bulb effect is a combination of humidity and temperature. And I think it's something like 35 degrees centigrade, 90% humidity. So as you get up to 40, 50 degrees centigrade, then you're facing what is euphemistically called mass mortality events, i.e. thousands or even millions of human beings dying in 2 or 3 days. And that's what's coming down the line as we start approaching 40, 50 degrees, because the temperature's risen over 2 degrees. What this concretely means is, according to one paper, is at 2 degrees centigrade, or maybe by 2050, there will be 1,000 million migrants on the move. And they'll be on the move because they can't grow food, because there's been famines and the things that famines lead to, which is mass slaughter and collapse of social systems and rape. And so the main scenario, the main annihilation scenario, is as we head over 4 degrees centigrade, which could be happening by mid-century or later in the century, then half the world is going to be uninhabitable. That's a firm, peer-reviewed prediction. 4 degrees centigrade, half the world uninhabitable, or uninhabitable for at least 6 months of the year, which in my book means uninhabitable. And what that means is, as has been predicted by the Potsdam Institute people on and off record now, I think, that we're looking at a small number of people surviving a mass death event, a mass annihilation, a mass extinction event of the human race. And some estimates say there'll be 1 billion people crowded around the 2 poles in Northern Europe or in Southern Africa and Australia and such like, because everyone else will have died. That's the situation. And just to finish off this section, we need to also understand that this catastrophe in life has happened many times before, arguably 5 times before in the Earth's history, when 70, 80, 90% of all life on Earth has died due to the release primarily of carbon and methane, sometimes through volcanic eruptions. And this is probably the most important statistic in my view, is the rate at which we're putting carbon into the atmosphere as you watch this video is 20 to 30 times faster than the rate at which carbon was put into the atmosphere through those volcanoes and what have you 30, 50 million years ago, which resulted in 95% of all life on Earth dying, the great dying events or the great extinction episodes in the Earth's history. Okay. So what I want to do next is to communicate again what this really looks like for many of you, the young people who are going to experience this level of catastrophe. And I think an important thing to communicate is that when social collapse happens, there's two aspects to it. When you're in a war, there's two aspects. And the two aspects are chronic dullness and boredom and absolute terror. So 99% of the time, your life is reduced, impoverished, nothing much is happening. And if you want to get an idea of what that feels like, then you know what it's like because we've just had a year of COVID. In other words, we're looking at a repetition of COVID-esque events so that all the good things of life start to get reduced because you can't move, because you haven't got the money, because there aren't the health services, because social disruption is happening, you can't get abroad, you can't do all the things that you were brought up to think you would be able to do. And then the other thing that social breakdown brings is terror, literally terror. And what I mean by terror is the sudden facing of death. And there's two aspects I can talk about here. One of the things about food crises, which basically trigger terror events, is they come suddenly. You'll be going into the supermarket one day and there'll be stuff there, and then the food system will collapse and suddenly there'll be less food. And again, many of you will have seen this in COVID. That produces a panic. And what will happen is 1 week the bread will be there, the next week the bread won't be there, and someone will be paying, $50, £50 for it in the car park, and 2 or 3 weeks later there'll be dead bodies in the car park because someone's so hungry that they'll kill people. And that happens very rapidly and is confirmed by the literature, the people that write about social collapse. The other thing about social collapse is the complete loss of material security, or law and order, as you might say. So what will happen is episodes where someone, a gang of young men, come into your house, they take your girlfriend, they take your mother, they put her onto the table and they gang rape her in front of you. And then after that, they take a hot stick and they poke out your eyes and they blind you. That's the reality of the Annihilation project that you face. Now, the reason I'm telling you that is because, first of all, we need to understand, and you need to understand, the actuality, the reality of what we face, because it's owed to you. And as you know, the climate change movement over the last 10, 20, 30 years has not told the truth. And as I'll come on to explain, unless you feel the horror and terror of what I've just said, you're not going to gain the strength in order to prevent or reduce that potentiality, that potential. So maybe you want to take a break now and think about what I've said, maybe come back and at any point take a break because it's going to be a long video, and then we'll talk about what we need to do. Okay, so what does this practically mean? What it practically means is this annihilation event, this extinction event, but I'm going to call it annihilation because it's a conscious project by people who know what they're doing. there's two things that need to happen. First of all, carbon emissions need to be reduced to zero in a matter of months or a few years. And secondly, the reality is we've left it too late in order to not be able to deal with what's coming without geoengineering. I'm not going to go into it because it's not really my field or my expertise, but though that is the dual agenda for your generation. And what you need to communicate to other people is these three aspects, that what we're dealing with is universal, it's going to affect everyone on the planet. It's existential, it's going to lead to mass death, potentially 1 million people being left on the planet by the late century. And it's existential, which means the rate at which it's getting worse is increasing. And it's that last aspect which needs to thrust you into taking high risk, high return action, as I call it. In other words, gradualism and reformism is out of the question because of the physics. And what that practically means is you have to take control over the state. The state is the only institution in societies that is capable of creating a rapid transition through telling industry and people what to do. This always happens in emergencies. It's a golden rule of history and sociology that the state needs to be controlled and the state needs to be used in order to enact these two things: research into geoengineering and enactment of that, and reducing carbon emissions to zero. So that's what we're going to focus on when we talk about what to do about it. And I'm just going to finish by trying to put what I've said into some sort of perspective. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, like, you're not the only generation that's faced annihilation. My generation had to face it with the nuclear holocaust situation. But of course, with your generation, it was different to mine, because with my generation, something had to happen. With your generation, nothing needs to happen for this to happen, as you might say. But it's worthwhile considering that for 99% of human history, 10, 15% of the population would die in violent circumstances like the one I've just described. And people used to live around 20, 30 years. So what we're facing here is not a catastrophe, everything's been fine, and then we're going into this depth. What's happened is, for most of human history, people have lived these terrible, short, brutish lives, as the phrase goes. And all that's happening now is we're returning to that catastrophic way of life that humans suffered in before 100, 200 years ago. So that's the task. And for the rest of this video, I'm going to be talking about what to do. Thanks.